Ever since September 11th, when an airliner suddenly goes silent over American airspace, it triggers an immediate question. Is the silence caused by a simple radio out issue or something far more sinister? This is the story of Northwest Airlines Flight 188. It's October 21st, 2009. Two senior pilots prepare for a routine flight from San Diego, California to Minneapolis, Minnesota. This trip normally takes just over 3 hours. In the left seat sits a 53-year-old veteran captain with over 18,000 flight hours. Almost half of that experience was gained from commanding aircraft similar to the A320. He'll be pilot flying for this trip. The first officer, aged 54, brings a similar depth of experience, nearly 14,000 hours total, with over 5,300 specifically in this aircraft type. The first officer will be pilot monitoring. As is reasonably common in large airlines, this was only the pilot's second day working together as a crew. On board are 144 passengers, 3 flight attendants and the 2 pilots. Their aircraft, an Airbus A320, is a popular workhorse for many airlines. Its sophisticated autopilot system and fly-by-wire controls are designed to enhance safety and reduce pilot workload. The plane has a robust communication suite, including 3 separate VHF radios, each capable of independent operation, a redundancy meant to ensure constant contact with air traffic control. And this will become important later on. So, while this was a Northwest Airlines flight, the airline was in the midst of a merger with Delta Airlines. For important context, the merger, which created what was briefly the world's largest airline, brought about complex challenges for all involved. Pilots from both carriers suddenly faced new standard operating procedures and different flight deck protocols. They had to adapt to new procedures every 2 months as the changes were gradually phased in. And among these changes was a new computerized flight crew scheduling system that would soon play a role as this story unfolds. 4:59 p.m., Flight 188 had a normal takeoff from San Diego. It climbs to its cruising altitude of flight level 370, or 37,000 feet, as the autumn sun begins to set. The flight attendants serve food and drink to the passengers who have settled in for their flight. As is often the case with Airbus flight crew, both pilots removed their headsets, opting to monitor air traffic control through the cockpit speakers. The autopilot dutifully guides the aircraft as it cruises along its pre-programmed route. All good so far. It's soon dinner time, and with the arrival of the lead flight attendant onto the flight deck, with meals for the pilots, the captain takes the opportunity to step away for a restroom break. Following security protocols, the flight attendant remains in the cockpit until the captain returns. At 6:39 p.m., the first officer checked in with Denver Air Traffic Control. Around 6 minutes later, at 6:45 p.m., the first Denver controller requested that Flight 188 contact the next Denver center, which the first officer acknowledged. Less than a minute later, the first officer contacted the second Denver controller and checked in by reporting altitude at 37,000 feet. This was acknowledged by the controller. With the captain's return to the cockpit, he and the first officer started discussing recent changes to their airline's preferential bidding process. It's during this time that the controller at Denver Center had to repeat a transmission to the aircraft. On the Denver controller's second attempt to reach Flight 188 and have them switch over to the next Denver Center on 132.17 MHz, the first officer responds, "OK, 3217, Northwest 188. This standard readback by the first officer will become important later on. We'll come back to it. At 6:57 p.m., although the pilots didn't know it yet, that would be the last radio transmission they'd make for quite some time. It wasn't long before both pilots were absorbed in a deep discussion about Delta's new preferential bidding system. The captain wasn't happy with his allocated schedule for next month, as it didn't suit him for personal family reasons. Frustrated with that, the captain pulled out his personal laptop to show the first officer his schedule. The first officer, attempting to help, took out his own laptop and began tutoring his colleague on the intricacies of the new bidding system. He placed his laptop on his tray table and proceeded to explain what he understood of the new system. Unlike Boeing pilots who have to contend with control columns between their legs, the A320's side stick design offers the luxury of proper tray tables, though these are meant for meals, not impromptu computer sessions. Now seems a good time to note that the use of personal electronic devices, or PEDs, in flight was strictly forbidden. The rule wasn't just about preventing distractions. Laptops could block critical flight displays, and their batteries posed a fire risk. Neither pilot could have guessed how their simple rule violation would soon spiral into something much bigger. Meanwhile, at 7:05 p.m., the 3rd Denver sector tried to contact Flight 188 to advise them of the assigned frequency for the 4th Denver sector. No response. They repeated the transmission. Again, no response. The aircraft entered the 4th Denver sector's airspace, and later the 5th, without making any radio check-ins. Back on board, the pilots, still deep in conversation about the new scheduling system, seemed oblivious to the attempts to contact them. Then things escalated. On the ground, air traffic controllers began their standard procedures for an aircraft that had gone NORDO, no radio communications. Denver Center controllers attempted multiple radio calls. By 7:24 p.m., Flight 188 had been radio silent for 27 minutes, quietly crossing through sector after sector of airspace. The 5th Denver controller, realizing something wasn't right, called Minneapolis Center to check if the aircraft had made contact. When Minneapolis confirmed they hadn't heard from the aircraft either, Denver tried reaching Northwest's dispatch office. But even this proved challenging. They were dialing an outdated number, inactive since a recent office relocation, because of the merger. Eventually, the controllers got through to Northwest's dispatch office. Airlines could usually reach their pilots through ACAR's text messages when radio contact failed. What nobody realized at the time was that while these messages were indeed reaching the aircraft, the pilots remained oblivious to the green ACAR's message alerts silently appearing on their displays. At 7:39 p.m., Northwest Flight 196 was asked to try reaching their silent colleagues. Back in dispatch, more ACAR's messages were sent. Each attempt at contact, including the international emergency frequency 121.5 MHz, went unanswered, and tensions on the ground began to rise. The Airbus A320's sophisticated autopilot was faithfully following the programmed flight plan, hitting waypoint after waypoint. The cockpit's ECAM display continued to show unacknowledged message alerts, while various radio frequencies carried increasingly urgent calls that went unheard through the flight deck speakers. What was happening? Had both pilots fallen asleep, or was there something more sinister at play? At 8:01 p.m., the flight management computer ran out of its pre-programmed waypoints and, as expected, silently switches from navigation to heading mode. On the primary flight displays, nav changed to heading. The aircraft does what it is told and continues northeast into the growing darkness, now flying a constant heading rather than its planned route. Meanwhile, in Minneapolis Center, the increasingly concerned controllers were running out of options. Multiple attempts across different frequencies had failed. Other aircraft couldn't reach the Phantom aircraft. Company dispatch messages weren't getting through. At 8:03 p.m., control was transferred to the 4th Minneapolis controller, who would soon face the unsettling realization that this aircraft was about to overfly its destination. Controllers had followed their procedures for possible suspicious aircraft, and preparations were being made for military intervention. The Minneapolis operations manager in charge had already contacted the domestic events network, and fighter aircraft were being readied for intercept. Also, the Situation Room at the White House was informed. On the flight deck, the conversation about crew scheduling continued, both pilots unaware of the building tension their silence was creating. Neither noticed when their navigation displays showed that they overflew Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport, their intended destination. The autopilot, designed with multiple layers of pilot alerting, continued to function exactly as designed, but those alerts were only effective if pilots remained engaged with their primary duty, flying the aircraft. Finally, a flight attendant called the cockpit, asking about their arrival time. This was the moment of realization for the pilots. With the spell of distraction now broken, the captain looked down at his navigation display and saw Duluth to his left and Eau Claire to his right. They had overflown their destination by over 100 miles. It was at this time, 8:12 p.m., the 4th Minneapolis controller made another attempt at contact. Simultaneously, Northwest Airlines dispatch sent yet another ACARS message. Flight 188 suddenly broke its silence, but on the wrong frequency of 132.125 megahertz. This frequency was eerily close to the last one acknowledged by the pilots, 132.17 megahertz. While the first officer's earlier readback of the frequency was correct, it seems that he did not activate it correctly at the time, possibly due to the earlier distraction. In the A320 cockpit, changing frequencies requires two steps, using a rotary dial to first select the desired frequency, then pushing a transfer button to activate it. For whatever reason, it seems that this step wasn't performed correctly. The crew, who had inadvertently tuned to Canada's Winnipeg Area Control Centre's frequency, told controllers they had overflown their destination and needed to turn around. The Canadian controllers, quickly establishing the aircraft's position over Eau Claire, Wisconsin, redirected the pilots to the correct Minneapolis Center frequency. When Flight 188 finally established contact with Minneapolis Center at 8:14 p.m., the pilot's explanation was, let's just say, a little understated.
Roger, we got that distracted.
What the pilots weren't aware of just yet was that this distraction had created serious security concerns 37,000 feet below them. During the 1 hour and 17 minutes of silence, the aircraft had triggered multiple layers of emergency response planning, and this will soon have significant consequences for the two pilots involved. More on that later. The controllers, who were still deeply concerned about potential security threats, needed to verify the cockpit was not compromised. The pilots assured them the flight deck was secure. There had been no security breach.
I just have to verify that the cockpit is secure.
It is secure. We got distracted.
As they approached Minneapolis, controllers, still uncertain about the situation, had the aircraft perform some specific flight maneuvers to verify the crew was indeed in full control of the plane. When pressed about what had caused the long radio silence, the pilots would only say they had been distracted by company issues, offering no further explanation.
Do you have time to give a brief explanation on what happened?
Just cockpit distraction. That's all I can say.
Northwest 188, is there any way you can elaborate on the distraction?
We're dealing with some company issues here, and that's all I can say right now.
They landed normally, over an hour late. Various agencies, including police and the FBI, were waiting. Both pilots were immediately breathalyzed. A follow-up drug screening was performed for 5 major substances of abuse. All tests returned negative results. The NTSB's investigation documented how even highly experienced pilots with thousands of flight hours could become so focused on a non-flying task that they lost situational awareness, resulting in their aircraft carrying 149 people flying silently past its destination at 37,000 feet. According to the controllers interviewed, Nordo flights were common events occurring several times per shift, with the standard response being to contact airline dispatch, after which pilots would typically re-establish radio contact. Though the airline requested forensic examination of the laptops, this was never performed, and the cockpit voice recorder's 30-minute limit meant no audio evidence was available from the period of silence. Some media reports suggested the pilots had fallen asleep or were fighting, which the pilots strongly denied. The Airbus A320 functioned exactly as it was supposed to. Delta, now Northwest's parent company, announced plans to add audible ACARS alerts that would be harder to miss. An unfortunate irony is that the pilots were deeply immersed in studying a new scheduling system that they'd ultimately never use. Despite their clean records up until this point, sadly, the FAA revoked their licenses within days. Flight 188 stands as a watershed moment in aviation safety culture, a stark reminder that even the most sophisticated automation cannot compensate for human distraction from fundamental flying duties.